Hello, and welcome to the BYU Family History webinar series. I'm Marin, and I'll be your host for this webinar. In a way of announcements, our next webinar will be with Catherine Grant next Thursday, the 15th at 4 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time. If you'd like to rewatch previous webinars, all of our webinars will be recorded and uploaded to our YouTube channel and our website for your convenience. During this webinar, if you have any technical problems, you can enter that in the chat box, and I'd love to help you out with that. Please make sure that your video camera and your microphone is disabled, just so that we can have a seamless webinar today. And again, if you have any comments, you're welcome to use the chat box during the webinar, and you can use the chat box for questions and comments, and those will be answered at the end of the presentation. For today's webinar, we're pleased to hear from James Tanner, who will be giving a presentation entitled Using American Immigration Patterns to Find Your Ancestors. James Tanner has a bachelor's degree in Spanish and a master's degree in linguistics from the University of Utah. He received a Juris Doctorate degree in law from Arizona State University. He worked for 39 years as an Arizona trial attorney. He previously owned a retail computer business and an Apple Macintosh software company. James has over 35 years of experience in genealogical research and is a blogger for Genealogy Star and the blog Rejoice and Be Exceeding Glad. He served for 10 years as a missionary in the Mesa, Arizona Family Search Library and is currently serving a family history mission in Maryland. He's a co-author or author of over 25 books on genealogical research and has presented at expos and conferences around the US and Canada. James has 7 children and 34 grandchildren. And as James gets things set up, I'll just bring your attention to some of the other webinars we have coming up this month. So we have Catherine Grant's webinar on the 15th, and on the 29th, we have Jean Nasbitt's webinar on where to begin when you start researching. Again, this recording will be posted on our YouTube page and our website. And you always can email us if you have any comments, questions, or suggestions. Thank you so much, and we'll turn the time over to James.
Okay, do you have my screen up now, Maren?
Yes, I see it. Thank you.
Okay. Well, welcome to another BYU Family History Library webinar. I'm happy to be able to participate here, rather long distance from Annapolis, Maryland. We'll be getting back to Provo very shortly because our mission for family search will be ending at the end of this month. We are going to talk about today using American migration patterns to find your ancestors. And the important first step is to understand what we're talking about when we talk about migration, because we've got 3 different terms here: migration, immigration, and immigration. Emigration and immigration are not the subject of this particular presentation. A migration pattern is a historical reconstruction taken from records that map the most common routes taken by populations moving from one country to another or from one section of a country to another. The migration patterns differ from immigration in that immigration is primarily the movement of populations from one political entity to another. So you emigrate with an E from the country that you live in, and you immigrate with an I into the country that you are immigrating. It's kind of a reference. Let me show you how it would work. With an example of the pioneers who came to Utah in 1847. The pioneers who traveled across the plains from their their home at the time, and primary home at the time was in a place called Nauvoo, Illinois. And they were actually immigrants. They were leaving the United States of America, and they were immigrating, IMM, into Mexico. But the way that they traveled back and forth from the United States over the years became known as the Mormon Trail, but it also is a migration pattern. And the migration pattern means that this was a corridor where people left one area to move to another area over a period of time. So that's kind of the difference between those three terms. To keep them straight is a little bit difficult at first, I know. Especially spelling them becomes a little bit of a challenge. So we're going to talk about how these patterns can affect and help us as we're doing genealogical research. Kind of get started to give an example of one of the problems that occurs quite frequently in online family trees. As you examine a family, or as I go back and do this either for people I'm helping or back into my own family tree, like on the family tree on Family Search or on Ancestry's family trees, or on my heritage family trees, or wherever else they're being online. Basically, what you'll see in those lists of the people looking at a family, you'll see that children are born in different parts of a country, or different counties, or different states, or even different countries. And the question is that reasonable? Could that have happened at the time that this particular family was living? And obviously, as we go back in time, travel becomes more difficult. And before the Industrial Revolution, which you can generally was established about in 1830, you're getting a lot of people who are ignoring the fact that travel at that time was mainly on foot or on horseback or in wagons, and that was about the limit of what they could do, except for on the oceans, obviously, or water. You had boats. So the questions are: was it reasonable for someone to have traveled that far within a particular family as to where each of the people in the family were born? But more importantly, is the question is, moving down through the generations, was it reasonable to that the people had moved from one portion of a country to another, or from one country to another? Classic immigration patterns include, in the United States, include the original settlers who came from the European countries into the American continent. And during that time, and then subsequent to the establishment of the country, people began moving westward off the East Coast and north out of Mexico, and into other different patterns of migration, where they began to move across the country. But knowledge of this helps us to identify elusive ancestors. If you're having a trouble with a brick wall ancestor or someone like that, almost invariably, as I've worked with those kinds of issues, the difficulty, the vast majority of the time, stems from looking in the wrong place. Even more frequently than looking for the wrong name. Sometimes we're looking for the right named person, but we're looking in the wrong place. And a knowledge of migration patterns will help us to sort out where these people would be expected to live. And if we're looking in a place where it was probable that they did not move that direction, then we can begin to reassess and do a certain different type of research in identifying where and when this person may have moved. The next step is to distinguish between people with the same or similar names. It's helpful to know the migration patterns, because knowing that your person's name may not help you in searching in a wide-ranging index. For example, if you search for John Smith in the U.S. Census records, that may not help you. But if you know that the John Smith was part of a group who moved from across the United States at a certain period of time, then that may help you to eliminate other people who did not move or who were not part of that pattern of migration. And in the reverse of using it in the reverse, you can, it provides you with the most likely place of origin. If you are looking at people in the northeastern part of the United States, for example, and you learn about the migration pattern, which was into Ohio, and then subsequently into the northern part of using New York and the Erie Canal system, you can begin to understand where and when the people might have been expected to show up in Ohio, or even further east into Indiana or Illinois, or down into other parts of the United States. So these are some of the concerns that we have. And another one is a very important factor in looking at the migration patterns of the people and the way that the populations have moved across the country, is to help us to prioritize our research efforts. It's important, if you know that the people have moved across the country or from place to place, to know what is possible and what is reasonable, and will help you to eliminate scattergun kind of research where you're just looking all over the place for people that you aren't really sure where they were. And this is particularly important when you're researching a family and they suddenly disappear from the record. For example, in England, if you were looking at people in the mid-1800s and they all of a sudden disappear off the census records, you may not know where to go to look for it. And it may be possible that you be helpful to know that there was a subsidized immigration policy in England, sending people off to Australia. And that was not as a result of them being arrested and made criminals. They were people who were actually paid to move out of their towns and villages in England because of lack of opportunity. Usually very, very poor people who were assisted to move to Australia. So important point here is that individual movements of an individual the movements of an individual can be unpredictable. But when a lot of people start to move in a particular way, following a pattern, then that becomes very predictable. You can predict about where the people will have gone during that time period. So we need to understand that this movement of people and the possible directions in which the migration and the development occurred has a great effect on where we are going to start looking for a particular ancestor. A migration pattern, knowing, for example, one interesting kind of observation is until well into the 1700s, almost at the end of the 1700s, when the United States was already established and they were in the process of creating the Constitution and building the United States government as we have it, as we've inherited it today. Almost the entire population of the country lived along the eastern seaboard. There were very, very few people who had moved inland, and that inland movement only began at the end of the 1700s. So in any kind of mass movement. So when you start to see people with looking for their ancestors in places like Kentucky and Tennessee, in the early 1700s, you can quickly determine, if you understand the migration patterns and the time frames involved, that is probably completely unreasonable, because those people could not have lived across the mountains in that early time period. So this is a way to predict where people are going to be, and discover whether or not the individuals that you're trying to follow were that the movements that you're seeing, or that you think you're seeing, are reasonable. And so knowing some general ones of these. Now, this is kind of the core of this whole issue here. There's a couple of things that are that have been established by some rather extensive studies. MyHeritage.com, or MyHeritage, the big online website, did a study that was published in the journal Science, and it's called It was a quantitative analysis of the population scale family trees with millions of relatives. And what they did was they took a individual, 13 million individuals in a validated family tree, and they wanted to establish some of the basic guidelines for population movements. And some of the basic, the basis things that they found were that before 1750, most Americans found a spouse within 6 miles of their birthplace. And for those born in 1950, that distance had only increased to about 60 miles. Now, you can always come up with exceptions. The people that you may have married someone across the country because you attended a university or moved across the country for whatever reason in the United States. Mobility has dynamically affected that. But back in 1750, the reality is that a person was born, got married, and died usually within 6 miles of their birthplace. So when you find and start seeing that people are according to what you see in a record, and you see a person that you think may be that your person, and you see that ancestor is now in a different state or a different part of the country, significantly far away, meaning they've moved much more than 6 miles, but many, many, many miles away, then that's almost an automatic, comes under automatic scrutiny, because that is not reasonable. It is not the common thing that happened among people. So you really need to be careful when you start seeing movements of population back and forth, particularly back and forth in the early years, beginning in the 1700s. The study that I'm referring to, this is the citation to it. Now, if you're viewing this live, you can come back when it's posted on the BYU Family History Library YouTube channel, and then you just simply pause the video and you can copy down this information. But if you look for this, you can search for this, and it was published online in March of this year. I would recommend reading this article because it is a tremendous, or even it's probably easier to read the blog posts about the article than to read the article itself. And if you look for the MyHeritage study in March of 2018, you can find a number of people commenting on it, including MyHeritage. And the discovery and the information there substantiates some of the rules of thumb that genealogists have used for a number of years. But in some cases, it's a little bit surprising, and it's different than you would expect. So it's something that gives you some grounding in determining whether or not the research that you're conducting about a particular family has kind of moved off into the realm of imaginary and sort of off the map, as we might say. That your family is no longer you're no longer looking at somebody who has some reality in the historical context. So the root equals migration. So the migration pattern is a route. It's a way that people traveled from one point on the map to another point on the map. And settlement in that area is the consequence. So you have the migration pattern, which is the pattern of the way that the people crossed the country and moved from one location to another. And that was limited by a whole list of factors. The first factor, of course, was the availability of land. If there was no land available, then no people were going to move to that area. And why wouldn't there be land available? Well, originally, the United States, before the United States was formed in the colonial period, there were differing claims to different parts of the North American continent. And so you necessarily able to move, if you were a British citizen, into an area that was owned by another or claimed by one of the other countries. So it wasn't until there was a consolidation of those claims that there could be movement. And so these are some of the consequences of working with this. Now, but another underlying important principle here is the question is matching up the research that you're doing, not only in two ways. First, you're going to match the research up to the time period, what was available in the way of transportation in the time period. But secondly, you're going to look at the time period and decide how reasonable it was for a person to move from one place to another, simply because of political or geographic or whatever other limitations that there might have been. And for the most part, the migration patterns are historically reflected by the easiest route. And knowing the geography of the country and understanding how people move from one part of the country to another, not just historically, but today, is very important. I'll come back to this point, but just an illustration is the interstate highway system in the United States. If you look at the interstate highway system, what you have is a map of the freeways across the country. And interestingly enough, those freeways follow every migration pattern in the United States. So if you need to know where the migration patterns were for how the people traveled from one point to another historically, going back to the original settlers in the early 1600s, then all you have to do is look at the freeways, and that's where they went. Now, of course, the freeways weren't there. They didn't have that ease of travel, and so it's only when those particular avenues of access were opened, either politically or physically, through the movement of the population and construction of roads and wagon roads and things like that, that you actually created a place for your ancestors. And as we move through looking at people's pedigrees and helping people do research for their ancestors, I find that very, very few people understand the movements of their ancestors. They have sort of a vague idea, perhaps, that their ancestors came from someplace in the East or from other place. But when I ask a question like, well, okay, so your family where were you born? I was born in, you fill in the blank here, New Mexico. Okay, well, how did your family get to New Mexico? And the answer is, I don't know. So that's one of the basic things that we need to add to our genealogical research, is the awareness of the movements, where these people lived and how they got there and why they moved and what were the consequences of their movement. Okay, so here's looking at it a little bit more concisely. Migration is history plus geography. So what we need to know is the history of the people, meaning the way they lived and the way that what kind of transportation they had available and what kind of social, economic, and cultural background that they had. and then put that in the historical context. It doesn't, you know, the classic history that we're talking about is not the one where where you learn about all the government changes and the wars and that sort of thing. This history that we're talking about is a very local history, meaning who lived when, where, when the counties established, when were the cities established, what were the dates of first settlement, how did they obtain the property? Was it a state land situation where they bought the land from the state, or was it a homesteading where they got what's called the government homestead, which began in 1860s, and people could acquire property across the American continent as the country expanded and made the land available. This is this one we're talking about history. That's what we're talking about. We're trying to talk about the way that the people lived and whether they were farmers, whether they were involved in cities and manufacturing. Did they move from manufacturing area where the industry changed, and so they had to all move someplace else? Were they living in the South during the Civil War period, or were they African Americans and to move to the northern part of the United States? These are all migration issues that we can examine and help to understand how and why and when our people moved. And then knowing the geography of the country, knowing the mountain ranges, the rivers, what the political boundaries are, when and where the counties were created. All of these items are things that go to make up. So when we do this, what we can say is that genealogy should be history plus geography. So we need to have a good basic understanding of both of these subjects about the place where we're living. If you haven't read a good history book on the United States, there are probably a few thousand of those out there. It wouldn't hurt to get a little overview of the history of the country, going back to the European settlement, and it might help if you have come from from some other ethnic group, if your ancestors were Native Americans, or if your ancestors came from another part of the world, such as China, or from the Far East, or from the Pacific Islands, or came from wherever they are. It might be helpful to understand their history. And then the geography of the country, there's another few thousand books on geography. Don't be disappointed if you think that you're going to pick up some information from your child or grandchild's high school history book, because that isn't going to help you a great deal with genealogical studies. The kinds of things we're looking here are like the histories of the states and the histories of the counties. These are much more valuable than to us as genealogists than simply knowing. It's helpful, by the way, and I don't want to diminish the value of understanding the overall history. I often refer back to a class I taught quite a few years ago that and to kind of condense the problem. The problem was that no one in the class seemed to realize that in the 1860s we had something called the United States Civil War. So that was, and that would have been made a major impact on the people and the people's lives in that time period. So you need to be aware of the major issues, and additional to that, though, in genealogy, just as we focus on families, we need to focus on history of the small areas. Okay, so what's the first rule of genealogy? I mean, this is something that everybody should be acquainted with by now. If you're learning about this for the first time, please make note of this. The first rule of genealogy is that when the baby was born, the mother was there. And this sounds, and it almost sounds a little bit oversimplistic, but it's something that I have repeated literally hundreds and hundreds of times. And I'm in the context of this kind of a discussion. I'll have somebody say, I'll say, well, where did this family, we're looking at this family, and it says here that the mother was born in Massachusetts in 1830, and that the baby was born in down the coast in Georgia in 1830, in 1850, and then the husband was born in Vermont. Okay, so how did these people get together, and how did this mother get down to Georgia to have a baby when the baby was born? And they look at me and say, well, that's what it said. My grandmother gave me this information, and I think it's correct. My answer is, well, when the baby was born, the mother was there. So how did the mother get to where the baby was born? And that seems to be I repeat that question sometimes 3 and 4 times before the person sits there and says, well, I get it. You know, that you really do have to focus in on what happened with the places that we're concerned with, and look at the reality of the time period and how much time it would take to travel from one area to another, and whether or not it's even reasonable if people were even going that direction. And that's really the question of the migration question, is whether or not that even was happening. So one of the things that to understand about genealogical research and genealogy is that genealogy consists of patterns. You may think you're looking at individual facts and sources and information and things like that, and we often get caught up in the minutia of genealogy being a very detail-oriented pursuit. But when we step back a bit and look at the way that the world works, or our world in the context of our ancestors, we'll start to see patterns. And I refer to my own family, for example. Many of my ancestors came to America very early. And some of the earliest ancestors settled in Massachusetts and in Rhode Island and Connecticut, and some of the other New England states. And so the question is, what happened to those people? Well, an early pattern of migration was that out of Rhode Island up into New York, and a large number of the members of our family, my family, moved from their homes in Rhode Island up to New York. Why did they do that? That was the way that the migration was going. That was the frontier. That was where there was land available. That was for a lot of different cultural things caused that. For example, land was inherited by the eldest son. And so if they had 3 or 4 or 5 other kids, sons, they didn't have a lot to go on. So many of those younger children in the family were the ones who picked up and went where land was available. And so if we look at that migration pattern, then what happened from New York? Well, in my particular family, obviously, because of the membership in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, they moved from New York to Ohio, and then from Ohio to Missouri, and then back from Missouri to Illinois, and then across the country from Illinois to Utah. And in my particular family, they moved down through to California, then back to Utah, and then down to Arizona. And so you get this back and forth, but when you get into the history and you realize what direction they were traveling and why they were doing all of those movements, it makes a lot of sense, and you're able to track that information very easily and understand where the records, you might be wanting to look for the records if you understand what the history was. But if somebody just vanishes off the census records, then you have no idea what the context of their lives were and a little bit about the history of where they were and who they were. You may not even be able to guess where they might have ended up. Okay, so when we're looking at these patterns, migration is one of those patterns. You know, we have patterns of the names in the family, we have patterns of the number of children, we have patterns of the culture on the background, but migration is just one of those patterns, and that's one of the patterns that pulls together many of the other factors that are involved in determining where and when a family lived, and accurately identifying who that family was. And one example, I was researching a family who began in Georgia, moved across the South. We traced them to Arkansas, and then all of a sudden they vanished seemingly off the face of the earth. They weren't around. And we discovered after doing some research that they moved west. They moved to Texas. And then, surprisingly, they moved back to Arkansas. And then the question was, why did this family move different direction than the standard going west pattern that had been established? Well, the date was the key. They moved back from Texas in 1860 to Arkansas because of the impending war and the problems that were occurred, and they just simply consolidated their family in Arkansas. So by attaching the history to the geography and to the movements, we're able to explain why it was difficult to find records for this family in Georgia and then subsequently in Arkansas, and then why we had to look into Texas. And then when they disappeared in Texas, we had to think about them going back to Arkansas. So here's a pattern, for example. This is obviously a pattern in a field of the crop field here. I'm going to guess it's going to be something like safflowers or whatever. And basically the patterns we see in the fence and the patterns in the crop give us an idea of what we're looking for when we're actually looking for, or you can visualize these patterns as images of rivers or lines or whatever across the country. That's what we're looking at. We're looking at a way that these people moved from one place to another, and it creates a line of movement that interprets just like looking at a field. So here we are looking at a map, an early map of the United States, of the America during the colonial period. And as we look at that map, we see some interesting things. If we focus on the sort of reddish colored section of the colonies along the coast of the Atlantic Ocean, we see that there's a brown area behind that, and then some other areas claimed by Louisiana and into Canadian and French claims of around the Great Lakes. Okay, so there's a kind of a distinctive line that's basically the population line of 1763. That's what's on this map. The red line along the colonies is the limit of the population in 1763. That's what I referred to a little bit earlier. So what you're seeing here is a limitation on the population's movement. If you find a reference in your genealogy that someone moved into Kentucky before 1763, it is simply not possible. It didn't happen. There was nobody there. The first settlement in Kentucky weren't the first mountain men crossing like Daniel Boone guys weren't there until the 1769, after that period of time. So not knowing this, it makes it fairly easy to accept information that turns out to be historically and geographically just simply not at all correct, not even closely correct, and could be very, very misleading because it looks like all that information is there and documented And then you find out that it doesn't even make any sense because it wasn't possible. So this is kind of a critical way of looking at the way that genealogical needs to be viewed. So here's my point here is that these patterns are very recognizable. If we look on the map, we can see which way were the people going to be able to move. They're going to be able to move north and south along the coast. But it's also important to understand is when were the roads created? When was there a road from New York, let's say, to Massachusetts, or from New York down through Pennsylvania to Virginia and to Maryland and Delaware and down into North Carolina and there? How long did it take to build roads that were passable and usable by the population? Of course, you could get in a boat and make it sea travel around down the coast, and that's why that was much easier than over the land travel. And understanding the migration pattern also needs to understand when these roads and other means of transportation were developed. That includes the railroads and the canal systems and everything else that goes along with that. So this map is a pattern. All the maps are a pattern, and they show you, when they're showing you the way that people live, there's ways to look at that as having a pattern. So if we understand, and this is to put it into a specific statement, is that these political claims are delineated by geographical limitations. Okay, if you look at the rivers, you see that they're the boundaries between the political claims. If you look at the mountain ranges, you'll see that they're the boundaries between the various political claims. And it's no accident that the boundaries of our states in the United States, in large extent, follow rivers and or coastlines or whatever else geographic limitations there were. Now, we have a tendency to draw straight lines in America, and that's interesting because they're very artificial and don't represent any kind of movement. Okay, so here's an example. The mountains. If you lived in Utah and Arizona, as I do, then my concept of a mountain is significantly different when I move east, and they say I'm entering the Allegheny Mountains or the Blue Ridge or one of the other big mountain ranges back here, the Adirondacks or whatever. We have a tendency to say, oh, well, those aren't really mountains. But if you're thinking in terms of the fact that these were covered with trees, that the trees were very close together and very thick, and when you live back here in Maryland, you begin to understand what trees are like. And it gives you a little bit of better perspective of what it's like to try to move through a forest, and understand that these mountains were covered with these trees, and they were not just little hills, but they were significantly high ridges and took a great deal of effort, and that the people had to either walk or ride a horse or put a wagon across here. There was only so much far you could go if you had to carry everything on your back. Or whatever, and where you were going. And if you wanted to go for an extended period of time, you had to be able to move a wagon or some other conveyance to take enough provisions to get you where you needed to go. And so these were major obstacles so we see the migration patterns through passes through the lowest parts of the mountains. So it's helpful to look at the physical topography of the United States. What does it look like, and what are we looking at the various barriers? The lakes, the rivers, the mountains were all barriers to transportation, and therefore they forced the people to travel through those areas. The rivers were a benefit. They were able, for instance, the Hudson River and the big Chesapeake Bay that we are living just a few blocks from, and all of the other big inroads into the United States became the major migration routes into the interior of the country. But when the rivers ran up against the mountains, then that's where you got the limitation of where they could go. So if we look at the pattern of the rivers, the major rivers in the United States, then as you look at those river patterns, you'll see that they are really the way that the population came in. In other words, look at this and then look at all of the major cities in the United States, and you find out that those major cities are sitting on, next to, or near one of these major waterways. So if they're not on the coast, like New York or Los Angeles or San Francisco, then they're sitting on a major river, like in the big city in Arizona, Phoenix. You think of it sitting out in the middle of the desert, it's actually sitting on the Gila River there. The Gila and Salt River run right through, just south and right through the valley of where Phoenix is living. That's why there is a town there. It's because there's a big river that runs through there. And if you look at the rest of the rivers, the Mississippi, and you see New Orleans, and you see St. Louis, and you see Chicago on the Great Lakes, and so forth and so forth, you basically can see where the people came by looking at the rivers that existed. And so if you look at any part of the United States and you see what's happening here, you'll see a map that shows you where the cities are. And if you study that for a little bit, you'll begin to realize how they got to the cities and why the big cities are where they are. Another factor, for example, we look at places like Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania, and we have a sizable town out there in the middle of the mountains. And how did that come about? Well, that's because of coal and mining and the industries that grew up around the mining industry and the steel industry and all of the other things. So as we understand this history, the geography, we begin to understand how the people moved and where they moved and how it used. We can use Google Maps and Google Earth. They're excellent tools to gain an understanding of the relationship between the towns and the cities. So one of the first things I'm ever going to do when I sit down to work with somebody and help them to do some research about their family this week and every week that I've had the opportunity to do that, the first thing I do is put all of the places that they're talking about into Google Maps and see how far away they are from each other and where they are and how they're located. If I see all of the places gathering into what you would call a cluster, if they're clustered together, then I begin to have some confidence that we may have identified the correct family. If they're scattered all over the country, then we need to start understanding what were the factors that could have enabled that family to be scattered, or are we going to have to rule out the fact that maybe most of these people aren't really related and aren't part of the same family. So a political outline map of the United States, this is what we'll normally think of as a map of the United States. The problem we have with a political map of the United States is that it needs to be overdrawn with the migration boundaries. And these patterns, the political boundaries, obviously the pattern of the states here is something that should be well known to anyone. But it's a good idea to understand this even from this standpoint. And we might ask a question, for example, a simple question that would help you to understand why when any settlement of across the Mississippi River was possible, is to ask when was the Louisiana Purchase. Now, if we're talking about history, sometimes we think that history is simply memorizing a series of dates. Now, that isn't as important to me, knowing that you know the date, but that you know that there was such a thing as the Louisiana Purchase, and that the existence or non-existence of that purchase would affect whether or not it was reasonable to assume that some ancestor had settled across the Mississippi River at a certain period of time. Well, just to answer the question, the Louisiana Purchase was in 1803. So anything that is discussions about settlement of the West before 1800 is fairly imaginary. It's not reality. That's what happened in the country. So how would that date affect your family's movement? Well, obviously, my family would not have been, would have had to have moved west after 1803, which they did. It was in 1847, began in 1830s, in the 1830s, and then culminated in crossing the continent in 1847 and 48 in the following years, and then migrating down to Arizona in the late 1800s and arriving in what is now, well, was the territory of Arizona at the time in 1877. So knowing the pattern and the directions and the dates is extremely helpful. For example, there's another example. How did technological developments influence migration? I've mentioned canals and railroads very briefly. The fact that we built railroads across the country facilitated movement, and you could then begin to believe that your ancestors may have moved from the East Coast into, from New York to Kansas, or from New York to Nebraska or someplace like that. Now, why would they have done that, and when would that have occurred? Well, the Transcontinental Railroad is an example of that. And how would the dates of the Transcontinental Railroad, the building of the railroad, affected your family history? Did they go by wagons? Did they move across the country on the Oregon Trail or on the California Gold Rush? Did they come across the southern part of the United States? Did they go down the coast and through Georgia, and then their farms were depleted by failure to rotate the crops, and the cotton that was being grown depleted the ground, and so they kept moving west across Georgia and Alabama and Mississippi and Arkansas and on over into Texas? Is that the pattern that we need to substantiate? So the first railroad, for example, across the country, the first railroad was built in the country in America in 1827. So before 1827, there were no railroads. This is the first railroad, period. And so you're not going to get someone traveling by rail from any one town to another before around this period of time. And then the first intercontinental railroad, which was the picture that we had in the background there, is 1869. So, and this actually is from Utah perspective, being from Utah primarily now. That's the pioneer period. The pioneer period is from 1847 to 1868 or 1869. So knowing that kind of information is helpful in determining whether or not your family it was even possible for them to make the trip that you seem to think that they did. And regardless of the fact that you think that these patterns may have been really random, they weren't. They're not. They follow rivers. They follow the roads. This is the Chesapeake Bay. This was the major entry into the interior up each of those vast river systems, which are, and by the way, they're called estuaries, and the estuary means that it is affected by the tides, so that even though it's called a river or even a creek here, in Maryland here, we live next to a place called Spa Creek. Well, Spa Creek is this huge estuary, and at the head of the creek is this little tiny trickle of water that turns out to be this mammoth bay into the estuary, into the Maryland. So the Chesapeake Bay is an example of ways that people could gather in. And here's another example, the Hudson River. These were the major migration routes because they were the easiest way and that was available to be able to cross and enter the country. So learn the history, learn about the geography, be aware of the crucial dates that are very important, that we need to always be aware of how the date and the affects what was going on. For example, we learn that the earliest English settlements in America were on the East Coast, in Virginia and Massachusetts. And then we want to know how far did they get? Well, if you recall the map that I showed that showed the extent of the population in 1763, it was more than 100 years, almost 140 years before there was any population movement away from the coastal areas of the United States. In fact, today in the United States, a very high percentage of the population of the United States still lives within a very few miles of the ocean, of one of the oceans, either the Pacific or the Atlantic Ocean, or the Gulf Coast, obviously part of the Atlantic Ocean. Okay, well, thanks for watching. I am planning a follow-up. This is the kind of thing that you need to get into more detail, and I'm planning a follow-up presentation in the not too distant future, as soon as we get back to Utah and get settled and get a schedule, probably right after the first of the year, talking about case studies of migrations, and we'll get into very specifics, talking about the Erie Canal and the railroads and the interstate highway system and the great migration of the former enslaved people from the south to the north, and some of the other migrations and the time periods and the effect that these had on people who may have been your ancestors. So are there any questions? Anything we need to resolve here? Out there in BYU land?
It looks like we have a comment from Irene. She just says, thank you. That was very interesting and gave her a few ideas.
Okay. Anything else? I guess we'll hope everybody understands that these are recorded and they will be uploaded to the BYU Family History Library YouTube channel. And they're also available on the BYU Family History Library website, which is part of byu.edu, that you can get adventures. Some of these, for those of people who are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the YouTube channels are not available in the chapels of the church. And for that reason, we are making them available separately on the BYU Family History Library website. Thank you, Maren.
It looks like we have a comment from Catherine. She asks, what might be the reason for a family to move from Ireland to Canada in about the 1830s?
Well, that's one of that's the immigration problem, but the migration route internationally, and that's very simple. The political situation in Ireland was, let's call it, horrible. It was a terrible situation. Not only was there constant warfare going on in the background of the country between the Irish and the British and the English. But there was also a tremendous famine that began shortly after that into the 1850s, but that's called the potato famine. And the earlier time period was just almost as bad. The people were literally starving to death. And the people who didn't die, and the number of people dying is estimated in the millions, but the number of people who left the country began leaving right around the beginning of the 1800s, and it started to peak going into the 1850s. So you're going to see a lot of people moving from Ireland, and the Irish group is the third largest group of people, if I'm remembering correctly. One of the top, least groups of people who immigrated to the United States. Any other questions?
It looks like we don't have any for right now.
Okay.
But if I see any more pop up, I'll mention it while I give the last closing announcements. So as
Okay.
I just
stop sharing.
go ahead and move over to the closing screen. Everyone that's still in the webinar is welcome to use the chat box if they'd like. But next webinar, we will be hearing from Catherine Grant. That'll be on the 15th at 4 o'clock Mountain Daylight Time. And we'll be overviewing the person page timeline from the recently updated family tree from Family Search. And I'll zoom in here so you can see the rest of the November schedule for this month. So next, after Catherine Grant's webinar, we'll be hearing from Jean Nasbitt, and she'll be giving a presentation entitled Research Where to Begin. If you have any questions, you're welcome to email us at fhl_webinars@byu.edu. And of course, this webinar will be posted on our website and our YouTube channel. And you can always follow us on our social media channels. We have a Twitter, a Facebook, and a YouTube channel. If you need any more updates, go ahead and join the email list or follow us on our Facebook feed. We tend to update on there as well. Thank you so much, and we hope that you have a wonderful weekend.